just finished an interesting special on the economics, and all along those lines, we've got another interesting discussion around politics. And I actually may continue some of the discussion that Shaquille just had, and maybe Sasha and Adam will join us as well. But a lot of people are paying attention to world politics. I'm going to bring Shaquille into the conversation, and also Adam. I know we've got Dan Worthington with us as well, and all along those lines. So we're going to bring in some folks with some interesting discussions. And
I didn't realize you brought me up, so I'm caught. I'm totally caught. But to be fair to me, it's an all-nighter, so I'm having a class.
No problem. Glass of wine. No problem with that. And everything. We've also got Rick Rosner joining us and others joining us as well, and we'll be talking world politics. But one of the issues that y'all brought up that I found quite interesting, and it plays into the political discussion. Me and Adam were having an interesting discussion in the background, and all along those lines is this notion of the importance of people that want to go into blue collar work, and even kind of that kind of work and how it plays in politics. I think we're going to find some interesting things in the way that the political divide is breaking on a class line and not just on a race line and other lines as well. Because one of the things me and Adam were talking about in the background is there are a number of jobs that are very much well-paying jobs. They might even put you in the top percent. I was using the example of truckers because I know two women that have their truck companies. I think one of them might be a European American, the other might be an African American and everything, but they have truck companies and are doing quite well, because I want to say that in both cases they own their rig. And then, as I was saying in the background, my uncle, who had passed away not that long ago, a couple of years back and everything, was a plumber, and his family had a plumbing company, and those plumbers made some pretty good money, better than some lawyers and doctors that I know, and all along those lines. So I know even in our political discussion, there's been this notion of political divides and everything. And the other thing that me and Adam were talking about in the background is I am somewhat of a fan of specialized education, but sometimes it can be frustrating because, as I have said before, I went to Marquette University, a Jesuit university, and as far as I'm concerned, I've joked about it on my own shows as well as other shows, and you'll love this, Dan. I consider myself to have two minors because, having gone to a Jesuit university, you were required to get whatever your major wanted to be, and I knew I wanted to go into journalism as far back in my high school years and all along those lines, but I also majored because I always had an interest in politics and everything in poli-sci. But my other minor, as far as I'm concerned, is theology, because if you go to a Jesuit university, just like if you go to a Mormon university, they're going to require you to take a certain amount of courses, and I always get them mixed up because that was decades ago and everything, but it was either 9 hours of theology or 12 hours of philosophy, or vice versa. It might have been 12 hours of philosophy and 9 hours of theology. But it being a Jesuit university, I can understand they want everybody. They didn't care whether you were majoring in engineering or art or or whatever you were majoring in, because there were even some famous actors that went to art.
This is precisely my complaints about the academic world, is that they fluff things in ways that are completely unnecessary. Now, the academics amongst us, and I'm looking at all of you and trying to pretend I'm not one, the academics amongst us seem to sneer and look down their noses at the local mechanic, who, I can tell you now, I have absolutely no idea why my car starts. I turn the key in, or actually these days I don't turn the key, I just push the button. And the car starts, and I hit the pedal and it goes, and I hit the other pedal and it stops. I don't know what's going on. Somebody else does. I don't steer at that person. He's got a different skill set, or she, and has different interests to me. But I can tell you this, believe it or not, I actually did have a job in the construction industry once. I back when I knew everything, back when I was significantly smarter than Rick Rosner over there with his high IQ, I knew everything. Nobody could tell me any different, and I was way too smart for school, so I left. I dropped out of school. And my mother said, yeah, you go get a bloody job then. So I went and got a job as an apprentice glazier, which is putting windows in, dealing with glass. I've still got a few scars, actually, from it. It didn't last very long because the boss said to me, listen, you're a great guy. Go get a job for a bank, because there's no way that you're cut out for glazing. And that was actually, I got my first job at 15 working for one of the biggest banks in Australia. And I managed to last 4 days before they sacked me. But, that's how it goes. And, then I just sort of decided the corporate world was more for me. But when you go and do an apprenticeship, or you go to trade school, they generally don't teach you when you're trying to be a plumber or an electrician or a mechanic or a chef or a builder or whatever. They don't sit there and say, hey, look, we need to do a course in, feminist pay gaps, and we need to do this thing on Indigenous studies. They don't do any of that. They go, hey, look, this is how you lay a brick. This is how you build a house. This is how you read a building plan, right? This is how an engine works, and this is the stuff that you need to know to be able to fix the engine. So, I think that could be a part of the reason why they generally are more productive than the people like Dan Worthington and Adam Lamparello, who are friends of mine, but they're academics. So,
Well, and I'm not sure if that. Because I hear your
Can
argument.
I say something?
you
Sorry,
better,
I
because
hear
I've
your-
left it open for you two.
I hear your argument and everything, but I think some of the tech schools, and I could be wrong. I know here in this area, meaning North Carolina, that some of the tech schools do require you to have courses outside of whatever you are being trained in, even in the tech field and all along those lines. But I would agree that they concentrate better than some of our universities do, and all along those lines in terms of actually concentrating on what you're supposed to be studying. But I mean, a lot of people, there are some people that are fans of what is called the liberal arts education, which is a very general education that has you studying a number of things that may be part of your major or not part of your major. And there are some that are not fans of that philosophy, but that is a academic debate, as I know Adam knows, that's been going on for decades and everything, and it isn't necessarily always.
Well, I can speak to this. So, one of the things that this country is faced with is the disappearance of the American dream. The idea that at a relatively young age, you can buy a house, you can have a family. And one of the reasons for that is because of the way that higher education has operated. Now, I taught at 3 law schools before I started teaching undergraduates. And I can tell you, at those law schools, they did 3 things terribly wrong. And I believe they do this at most law schools. Number 1, they hire faculty who have absolutely no real world experience. And that translates into a curriculum that is largely not practical and that has upper division elective courses that are largely theoretical or that teach you doctrinal knowledge but not how to apply it and use it in a practical context. Number 2, law schools hire faculty that are almost universally liberal, and they come into law schools with an agenda to push their social and political philosophy on students, which has no practical advantage for the students themselves. And number 3, they charge exorbitant tuition, which is driven in large part by the exorbitant salaries that faculty with no real world experience and who are so politically biased in one direction have. So when you combine all of these things, you get 2 things. You get a student who is graduating at 26 years old from a law school with 6 figures worth of debt, and number 2, without the skills to succeed from day one in a law firm or in a law practice. That is a recipe for disaster. How are they supposed to buy a house? How are they supposed to have children? How are they supposed to even spend in any meaningful way? Higher education has become more like a corporation, and it's doing a disservice to our students. And the number 1 culprits that I blame are the faculty and the administration.
But I have to teach you, Adam, because actually I mentioned the Jesuit courses that I took and everything. I can honestly say that, and I do not remember all of their names. I think of them one might have been McGuire, and part of the reason I maybe remember that is because he's also has a similar name to our famous coach and everything that brought us a championship back in '77 and everything. But one of the things that I enjoyed about the theology and philosophy courses I took was that, as I have stated, I may have come from some liberal and progressive backgrounds and everything. But Dan, one of the things I enjoyed is when I was in Marquette in the 80s, and given that was decades ago and everything along those lines, 2 of my favorite courses were actually courses that were on the opposite end of the spectrum. Because Mr. McGuire was probably a practitioner of what some people, and I think the founder, who was from Peru, I believe, or one of the founders, just recently died. But I think I would say he was a practitioner of what some people call liberation theology, which is a very liberal philosophy that believes that you can be engaged in revolution and still have some theological beliefs and everything. So he was definitely a liberal philosophy and theologian. But the other person did literally, and I joked with you about this earlier, I may even have the book still floating around here, taught me who the heck C.S. Lewis was and the Screw Tape Letters, and he was very conservative. So I had 2 professors. They were on opposite ends of the spectrums, and I had a great deal of respect for both of them because I felt that I learned something from both of them and all along those lines.
But what you just said, I think, is specifically kind of at the heart of the reason why there is such division between the rural parts of the Australia, the United States, etc., and the blue collar workers versus the white collar workers, right? Because everything you just said, whilst it might be fascinating, I don't think the farmer cares too much. Do you know what I mean? I don't think the truck driver cares too much about that sort of stuff. And that's the heart of the issue. I think I'm going to oversimplify this issue a little bit, but I don't mean to be negative towards academics. I have some concerns about the way academics is working today, but academics is important, and people need to be able to gain more knowledge. And certainly, I've needed to do that for what I do for a living. So I'm not trying to shit all over academics, but I use this example all the time. You could get a PhD in how to drive a car, right? You could know everything: how to heel and toe, how to drift, how to this, that. But if you've never actually driven the car and you come to me and ask me for a job as a driver, and I say, well, okay, what's your qualifications? And you say, oh, well, I've got a PhD in driving a vehicle. Like, okay, but how long have you been driving? Oh, I haven't. This is my first job. Versus somebody who's got no qualifications in driving, but they've been driving for a really long time, and they used to do go-karting when they were a kid, et cetera, et cetera. I think you guys get the point of what I'm trying to say. I'm going to be more interested in that person. And when I worked for financial institutions, I used to get this issue all the time because corporate head office would say to me, you need to look at this person, right? So I get the person comes in, they've got a master's in applied finance. And they've got, they've done their undergraduate degree, they've gone on to do their master's, they've got high distinctions, really bright, know what they're doing. And I've got somebody who doesn't actually have such great qualifications, but similar to me has won the stock market competition or has been trading, has done all these things. And that person comes in, same age, and says, I don't have all of the qualifications I need, but here's my trading results. This is what I've done. I look through their trading results, say, okay, well, these few trades you didn't do too well. What happened? Oh, look, I thought that maybe if I did it this way, it would work pretty well, but it didn't. I actually lost money on that, but I adjusted my positions and I adjusted my strategy, and this is what I'm doing now. Yeah, I like that guy. I don't care that he doesn't have all the qualifications. Then I sit down with a kid who's got their master's in applied finance. And this is actually a very specific, real example. And I'm talking to him about the way that interest rates work and the compounding of those interest rates every day. And he refused to accept that. And I was trying to explain to him that the academic way that bonds are priced versus what's actually on our screens are different. And this is the reason why they're different. Wouldn't accept it. Argued with me about it. And his maths was incorrect. And so every time I get somebody who I said, look at their resume, oh, they've got a master's, they've got this and that, from one of the top universities in Australia. And I sit there and I'll be like, oh, no. And especially if I know that corporate's going to make me employ that person, I know that I've got to, it's not so much I'm going to teach them, it's that I've got to get them to unlearn some of what they think they know, because some of what they think they know is theoretically correct, but in reality it's not.
No, but
sorry, I think Dan.
Yeah, and if I can just say something real quick, and then I would like to defer to Dan because Dan has more experience in academia than me. I believe he was a team. So, in 1975, when my parents were married for 10 years, they were able to buy a house in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, for $75,000. That was, and yes, they incurred some debt, but what we're having now is a situation where young people are incurring over 6 figures worth of debt when housing prices are exponentially higher. And higher education should be the path to the middle class, but it's not. Because, for example, in law schools, what you have is extremely high tuition, a lack of a practical education, and ideology trumping practical skills. If you're a lawyer and you apply for a faculty job at a law school, you have no chance of getting hired. They look down on practical skills training. They look down on giving students the skills that are going to be to their economic advantage while they saddle them with debt. And there has been a proliferation of law schools of very low quality that have preyed on these students and caused them to be saddled with crushing non-dischargeable debt. When I look at law school faculties, I'm appalled. I'm absolutely appalled because they are down people's throats and not giving them the skills they need. And Dan, you're more experienced than me, so maybe you could speak to this.
Sorry, can I just make a quick side note? Look what happens at business school. You do a Bachelor of Business or a Bachelor of Economics or something like that, Bachelor of Commerce. Your lecturers have never run a business before. Are they going to try and teach you how to be a business person?
That's my point.
Yeah, well, there are some good law schools. I am going to defer to Dan in a minute, and Rick and everything. I will just tease it before I defer to Dan and everything. that's actually where I kind of defend academics to some degree, but not totally, because when my dad taught and he is retired, and I've told y'all all that he's been going through his heart recovery and it's going well, so I am very glad to hear, because actually he's going, or well, he just went to an appointment earlier to check on some minor issues, but hopefully they're again cleared up and everything. But when Dad taught at the UNC, the University of North Carolina, he was teaching some of their basketball players that were noted basketball players. It wasn't Jordan, but it might have been Warren Martin and some others. But y'all don't know this because y'all have never met my dad, because I haven't brought him on a show yet, as of yet, and everything. But he is not one to hold lightly. He has some very liberal views, which might not surprise y'all based on y'all's conversation with me and everything along those lines. But he was not just going to roll over. So there were some people that took courses that thought that they were going to get kind of that basket weaving course. So they did not get the basket weaving course because he didn't care that they were the star of the team, and he wasn't going to give them just an A because they were a basketball player and the coach wanted them to give them an A. They had to earn the A, and all along those lines. So he was definitely very and he even makes some jokes about it. He's like, yeah, Warren Martin, and I'm just using him as an example, and some others came in there, and some of them have gone on to successful NBA careers, thinking that they were going to get a automatic A because they thought it was going to be an easy course. They didn't know my dad.
And then let's hear from Dad, and then Rick.
Yeah, Dad first, and then Rick.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, so I got my doctorates in law and education back in 1989. So it's been a while, right? And but I taught at 4 universities. I was dean at 2, and so I have a little experience in this area. But the thing you cannot teach is common sense. The thing that because I grew up poor and from a poor family, I had to work, and it is all about putting in the work, putting in the effort, planning, setting goals, doing the kinds of things that you have to do. America is still a land of opportunity, but you have to put in the work. It costs more, certainly, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that you have to work harder and smarter and not play the victim mentality, because that's what destroys you. If you believe you can do it and you put in the effort to do it, you can do it, because America is practically the only other place in the world right now where that works. There's some other places. I mean, Jackie's certainly been successful, and Rick's been successful. Adam's been successful. Mark's been successful, but it didn't come by sitting on your laurels, wanting the government to take care of all your problems and bitching about everything that's happening socially. No, you pull up by your bootstraps. You do the work. Now, I'm part Native American, so I'm a minority. You can tell by my build, but that didn't ever affect me. I didn't even think about it really, except the University of South Dakota, where they had Native American Indian law stuff, and I was on a national board for Native American studies and that kind of stuff back then. But I never paid attention to that. Why? Because America is a land of opportunity, and you just work hard. Now, I don't scrunch my nose at anybody in the trades. What a noble thing to do. And again, America is a great country because there are so many paths to being successful, so many paths to being able to build a livelihood, because of the way our economy works and everything is structured, until when the government comes down, restricts it, controls it, screws it up, destroys it. Then we have to fight for our liberty, right? Fight for our freedom, fight for our ability to gain a livelihood and do those things. Liberals, Democrats want to destroy that, want to regulate it. They want to control every aspect of your lives. But that's all part of the globalist agenda, is control us and to destroy our sovereignty and to keep us from having the freedom that is our God-given right. And they won't even do us to acknowledge that there is a God, other than the God of this world who's been the deceiver of the world. And so hey, happy day. Go ahead, Rick.
All right. Well, about God, I am participating in an ongoing discussion about the nature of God that's been put together by a guy who's trying to put together a bunch of high IQ people to discuss God. So, I mean, you can, I mean, there's room for God in discussions and life. And, you know, I've got a giant Jesus in my office. I'm not Christian. I'm freaking Jewish. I looked at, anyway, fine. I found, I found
he was your guy. He was your guy. I mean,
yeah, and he was a good guy. He remains a great guy, whether or not you believe he was the Messiah or not. Yeah,
Rick, I'm not gonna publicly state what my IQ is, but I'll certainly tell you in private. And I actually think that there is based on non-theology, based on science, I think that there is as much evidence that God exists as there is that he doesn't, based on theoretical stuff, and you get the string theory and all that sort of stuff. I do want to make it.
So listen, I believe in God. I'd rather talk to you about God than freaking string theory. But,
well, unfortunately, I'm going to bring string theory to the debate. But I just want to very quickly say a couple of things to Dan, and then I do actually have a response about the women vote.
Let me finish my thing, which is my main point is I found out something surprising. I just looked it up, and this is a problem with academia. Only 20% of U.S. graduates are in STEM fields.
Mm-hmm.
You know, engineering, math, physics, chemistry, and you know, I took a ton of STEM back before it was called STEM, and I never ran into politics, but I did run into a certain amount of practical training. We had to take lab courses, and if you're an engineer, you have to do so. And we're way behind. China graduates 41% of its graduates in STEM, and you know, you don't run into very much politics in STEM education. And in fact, when, you know, before I block somebody on Twitter, I take a look at their profile, and there's a ton of technical training among people with hands-on. I mean, there are a bunch of people with technical training who support Trump. You know, nurses, frickin', you know, people, engineers. So, you know, if the U.S. wants to keep leading the field, and if you want to have graduates who, you know, maybe would be more amenable to real world hands-on stuff, we need to push STEM harder.
I agree.
We have this particular show, and Jatovi's not here, which I was expecting him to be here. So, unfortunately for you, Rick, this is going to be slanted a bit more on the right against you. But we do love you, my friend, so don't worry, we'll go easy. I just want to come back to a couple of government things and just respond to something that Dan said. Look, Dan, I think, the America was the land of milk and honey, or is that Australia? Both of us, I'm not sure. But, you know, all of the opportunities. My concern is that actually I don't think that's the case anymore. And what I base that on is my own personal experience. I was earning reasonable money as a dealer, you know, working finance, and you know, I still love it. You know, I'd have 6 different telephones, and I'd be on the phone, and I'd be, you know, I'd have all my screens there, and when I was in charge of the floor, it was exciting, it was fun. But you know, for me to really get great success, I found myself constantly butting my head up against regulations. And in the end, I gave up. And I went from, you know, I was 27 or 28. I was the Associate Director of Corporate Finance and Strategy for a reasonable sized financial institution in Australia. And I gave that up, much to the chagrin of my girlfriend at the time, long-term girlfriend at the time, and my family, who were like, "What are you doing?" And I turned down jobs at most of the biggest names in the banking world. I turned them down flat because I didn't want to enter into a non-compete. And then Mr. Genius over here went to Dubai to try to raise money for a derivatives and options trading, volatility-based hedge fund. I can't explain that to people who work in finance, let alone try to explain it to some of the Arabs. But you know what? They gave me a start. They actually gave me a go. And then, you know, I found myself in Switzerland. One of the whitest places on earth is the particular parts of Switzerland I hang out in. You know, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Austria, Germany, in that sort of border region of those areas. I'm the only guy like that, but there was no racism there. They're just fascinated by my experience and what I can offer them, etc. The point being, I had to leave Australia. So I tried to imagine, would I be able to have achieved what I have achieved if I was born in the United States. And I feel like I would have been able to 20 years ago, but that I can't now. And one of the most obvious reasons, or one of the most obvious things that shows that, is what happened when I was running the fund in Switzerland. We complied with what's called the EU AIFD, the European Union Alternative Investment Fund Directive. That allowed me to take clients from pretty much all over the world, and I could passport into Australia through Singapore. The one place I couldn't touch was the United States. In order to face the United States, I had to set up in another jurisdiction. Then, if I wanted to do it, it had to be, private arrangements and things like that, because I would have to re-qualify for Series 7 and Series 10 and things like that in the US to comply with their regulations. I pointed out to them, you realize that I used to teach people this Series 7 stuff in Australia? I used to actually teach this stuff. Now you want me to qualify for it? What's wrong with the qualifications I've already got that proves I'm competent? No, you're going to do all this. So the amount of hoops that I had to jump through, it was like, Now, if it wasn't for the amount of money that was committed to us from the United States, I wouldn't have bothered. I actually would not have bothered. And I tried to find ways to avoid that. And we were able to do that successfully in the end. But that's my concern with the US. Now, Adam brought up the issue of housing affordability and other affordability in the US. I am definitely not anti-immigration. My family has benefited enormously from being able to immigrate to different countries around the world, and the biggest one is the United States. More of my family members actually live in the United States than they do in Australia or New Zealand. But obviously the ones I'm close to live in Australia and New Zealand. So I look at that and I go, okay, what would help? One of the things that I find most grating is when I hear people say, we don't have enough young people. We don't have enough people being born. We're below the replacement for birth rates. So therefore, we need to have more immigration. See, if you didn't have more immigration, what would happen? As far as economic theory goes, what would happen is that housing prices would fall because there'd be lower demand. And if housing prices fall and there's lower demand on services, younger people would then be able to get into housing and be able to build a life. So when older people say, hey, I put myself through university and I had a job as a waitress and, I paid my $30 a week. Yeah, that's great. People today cannot do that. So if what you do is you bring in mass immigration to keep up the prices of housing and the prices of everything else, I don't have a problem with that per se, but you have to recognize that the local population is being left behind and it exacerbates the same problem. And in one generation's time, all those immigrants that moved to the United States in hope of a better life, their children are going to have less children because they can't afford to do it anymore. And you're just going to perpetuate the same thing. So I think, unfortunately, it's one of the places where I will say we need more government intervention. Government maybe needs to come in and subsidize things and help people to get into their first homes and all that sort of stuff. There needs to be some sensible conversation about that. But the idea that you're just going to import people and say, well, that's what we're going to do, we'll fix the problem that way. No, it doesn't work like that.
But Shaquille, isn't that part of the problem? And I was glad to actually be on mass transit yesterday and hear the woman say that it was working for her, but it doesn't always work. But part of the problem with gentrification is that the prices or new houses come up in neighborhoods that used to be dilapidated or are bad neighborhoods, and then they bring up these houses, kind of like the houses that Adam was talking about, that are fancy to build and it costs a lot more than the average person can afford. So then people like, say, from New York, if I'm here in North Carolina, from New York and California, they can afford those houses, come in, and then they move the other people either they either move out way out to the country, or they can't afford. But what I was going to say is there was a young lady on the bus, and I just overheard her conversation. She wasn't talking to me and everything, but she was getting like some supplement, some money in order to help her get into a newer, better. Matter of fact, even said they were going to help.
So let me take a. I'll be very quick. Let me just take a cheap shot. I sent you a cartoon as a bit of a laugh and a joke. But if gentrification's a problem, so the solution then, by logic, would be reverse gentrification is really what we should do. Let's bring down house prices by driving up crime rates and going to the wealthiest suburbs in America and destroying the homes there and taking away their services, killing their roads, and making the housing stock cheaper. That would be the solution. Gentrification occurs because of an increase in population and a desire for the suburbs to look nicer or the area to look nicer, upgrade the houses, etc. You can't have it both ways. You can't sit there and say, inner city New York, look at the condition of places, they're not well looked after, so somebody should actually look after it and build something nicer. And then when somebody builds something nicer, say, well, you've gentrified the area. Well, what do you want?
Right. See, I agree with everything that you're all saying, but I want to go back to this idea of the American dream and how it was possible many years ago, but isn't possible now. One of the best ways to enter into the middle class and have that dream, to buy a house, have a family, and live a good life, is through an education. But education these days is so incredibly expensive at the undergraduate and graduate level that you are saddling students with high levels of debt before they even have a chance to get out into the workforce. At my alma mater, USC, the tuition is $70,000 a year, not including room and board. And when I taught at law school, I realized a few things. Number one, I taught hundreds of law students that I knew had no hope of ever being competitive in the legal profession. And you want to know why? Because when you're the dean of a law school, you find out something very quickly. You find out that the parent university cares about you only to generate revenue for them. And so what law schools do is they increase tuition, they accept people with lower credentials, and those people are typically from the middle or lower classes, so they take out debt and their employment outcomes do not match the debt that they are assuming. So I agree with Dan that you've got to pick yourself up by the bootstraps and avoid a victim mentality, certainly. But they are stacking the deck against these kids, and you saw from 2000 to about 2015 a proliferation of predatory law schools that saddled students with debt, with faculty who weren't qualified, and with universities that saw it as a cash cow. And as a result, you have a large population of people where they could never buy a house, they can't have children because they're going to be busy paying off non-dischargeable debt for 30 years. That's wrong, and that's antithetical to what we should be doing to ensure opportunity for young people.
And they pay exorbitant money to employ magnet people. This guy's won a Nobel Prize. This guy's developed this new thing, and that guy is in the faculty, and you'll go through that university for 5 years, and you won't do one lecture with that person. You'll never meet that person, but that's the draw card for why you should go to that university.
Just really quickly, Adam, along those same lines, because I brought it up on some other shows. I have got a number of friends that are adjunct professors, not just you, Adam, but others as well. And I am oftentimes amazed at how the system is so stacked that they oftentimes have to go on these year-to-year contracts and oftentimes are struggling. Fortunately, one of my good friends is a former TV producer, so he has some side money that has helped him get through. But I am fascinated he is able to survive off of that adjunct mentality and everything.
Adjunct professors are slaves for the schools, but I'd like to defer to Dan on this because, like I said, he has more experience than me. He was a dean, I was not, so I'll defer to him and his thoughts.
Well, here. I was fortunate enough to get scholarships and at every level for some reason, and it wasn't. Pardon? Can you hear me?
You froze from your back.
You're freezing quite a bit.
Oh, okay. I don't know why. I was able to get scholarships at every level through law school. After the first year, I got scholarships to go. I formed a joint degree program in education, doctoral program there. Got scholarships to finish up my education. I had a family of 5 kids, so I really needed it. So it was a great blessing to me. The thing is, if you want to take higher education, you want to be successful in higher education, you got to know how to succeed in higher education, and you got to be smart about it, right? So the problem with our society is we've set up our culture so that people who aren't really they don't have the acumen, the intelligence to be somewhere. They try to get them in anyway, in the interest of trying to equalize whatever. And what that does is dumb down the whole experience and creates a kind of debt and failure that you're discussing, Adam. And it's not fair to them, and it's not fair to the way our system works. those folks would be better off in something that they could succeed in, and find and to be able to use their genius. And I believe everyone has genius, by the way, to find where their genius would be most successful in life. And I think that everyone is blessed by their creator with genius and ability. They just have to find where that is. And so I think education, quote unquote, as a deal is corrupt. Like you said, the law schools and the business schools are there to gather more tuition. And I had to create my own law review course. That's how useless my law training was. And so I actually got the highest grade on my bar exams. I created my own bar review course, and I taught several others who had failed and got them through because I just put it together. This is before they had all this extra technology where you could do it. But everything that you need, you can go online at YouTube and learn practically anything you'd want to learn now. It's available online. And so there's really no excuse for not going out and learning about something and doing something useful, because it's all available, especially in Western civilization. You just got to have the go to it and pick me up to be able to do it, create a plan and execute it by going and learning. The resources are there.
I agree with much of what Dan said. I wasn't serious about anything until I was 26. My time in college was dicking around, which wasn't totally useless. I read a lot. But I was not cut out for making productive use of my time in college. But it was okay for the most part, because when I went, college was $1,500 a year, including room and board. But
just really quickly, one of the things that I've been hearing more and more people talking about, this comes down to world politics and even some of the divide and everything along those lines, is that there has been an increase, and y'all can Google check me and everything, I want to say, in startups and in entrepreneurship. I think a number of people are going that route, and I was actually watching, because actually Raleigh, Charlotte, and one of the other North Carolina cities are leading the charge in remote work. So a lot of people are choosing not to go into an office because of the cost of the offices, which you alluded to, Adam, and everything. And there are a lot of people that are starting businesses and are building them from their bootstraps. And it's one that has a history in that, a family history. I've talked about that before. My grandmother literally started the first African-American library in our state capital of Raleigh, and my parents started a radio station with no radio background and everything in the 70s and all along those lines. So I've seen how that can work, but that was historical and all along those lines. But
let me finish.
The world a increase in startups and in entrepreneurship, because it does seem
okay, let me finish my point, which applies to what you just said, which is the U.S. and probably most developed countries have a high school to college pipeline, and which is not necessarily appropriate for every person. We need to figure out a greater spectrum of training, experience, and education alternatives for kids leaving high school that addresses them where they are.
It's something that, firstly, just before the show at some point, I've been wanting to try to say something to Rick about the poll numbers and the women voting more than men. It just hasn't happened the last few shows, so please just leave me some time to do that at some point. I just want to come back to this issue that Adam and Dan have been talking about, and to some degree what you just said, Rick. Look, I think that some kids just hate academics, and for those kids, don't force them through. Just let them drop out when they're 12 and get them to learn something else that they're going to be more interested in. Because there's no point. You force a 12-year-old to stay in school and they don't like it, and then they go and join a gang and they just go off the rails. It doesn't help. But I want to come to something. Don't answer this, Adam. But how many students do you actually teach in a typical course, right? You talked about USC, one of my favourite universities, costing $70,000 a year. Well, you want to see what they charge the medical students, but $70,000 a year. Now I know we can say, it's the University of Spoilt Children. Well, look at what they charge at Stanford or UC Berkeley or many of the universities, Harvard, Princeton, Yale. We can just go through the list, right? They're all very, very expensive. USC is probably a bit more expensive than them, but they're all very expensive. Now, okay. If I was to want to get the qualifications or get the knowledge, right, I could employ Adam and Dan. And I reckon if I've got a 2-to-1 ratio, I've got 2 university professors and just me, I'm probably going to learn a lot. So let's look at the mathematics. If we said to 20 kids, we're going to cut your university qualifications, your prices in half. You're going to give us $35,000 a year. So by 20 kids, that's $700,000. I could say, hey, Dan, I'm going to give you $4,000 a week. Hey, Adam, I'm going to give you $4,000 a week. And because it was my idea, I'm going to take the lion's share. I'm going to take the other $300,000 or $350,000 for myself. You know what? Those 20 kids with one-on-one tuition with Adam and Dan, I would argue, were more likely to get a much more robust understanding of the law and would more likely than not get much better grades and results in law. But we don't do that, because what we do is we have university kids that are paying for the athletics team. That, look, I love the Trojans, but they're paying for that. They're paying for the new stadium. They're paying for the new this and the new that. That's where all their money's going. It's not going to their own education.
Right. So, 2 things. What you're talking about is akin to what would be called an apprenticeship model. And I think that would be very effective. But that is not a proper licensing pathway in the United States, although I would say that it should be. It was in Virginia for some time.
That's my point.
And
But that's my point.
I agree with you. And what I would say is, so when you have law schools of different rankings, both the tuition and the loans that the federal government gives should be proportional to the outcomes that those law schools are likely to achieve. So if you're going to go to a law school such as Wayne State University, for example, they're charging $50,000 tuition, or Thomas Cooley Law School, you are setting these kids up for absolute disaster. And Dan is right. There are the resources out there to gain practical skills. But what these law schools are doing is increasing the revenue of the university at the expense of these kids. And when you look at law school curriculums, you see a 3-year program. Now, in the first year, typically you have courses required, like civil procedure, criminal law, torts, contracts, all well and good. Next 2 years, you basically have electives. There's no reason law schools should be 3 years. They should be 2 years. And there's no reason that law schools should not embrace practical training. What law schools are now doing is they're favoring JD and PhD candidates because they're becoming more akin to a social science and academia type focus rather than a practical skills focus, because law schools look down on faculty who have real world experience, and they look down on practical skills training. So what they do is precisely the opposite of what vocational skills do, while saddling students with debt and forcing deans to admit students who are not qualified because the university presidents are so hell-bent on money at the expense of anything else.
Should we even be making so many? Hold on.
Dan can speak to this better than I can.
But wait, should we even be making so many lawyers? We've talked on previous shows about how there's a shortage of doctors and a shortage of spots in medicine.
There's a shortage of lawyers too, though.
There is a shortage of lawyers.
Yeah, but the shortage of doctors in the United States is, in my opinion, and they can sue me if they don't like it. I shouldn't say that, but they can. Is as a direct result of the AMA lobbying universities to reduce the numbers of medical places. That's
right.
That's just what's happening. I do want to just address something that Adam said about the emphasis on academics in law. You know what? I was absolutely gobsmacked when a dickhead from the middle of nowhere in Australia, am sitting there discussing case law and discussing the amendments, and I brought up an issue with Adam about the Third Amendment, and he didn't agree with me. but I wasn't going to let it go lightly. So, and I still don't let it go lightly. I still talk to him about it now. I read him part of the Magna Carta the other day in order to like, hey, look, this is what this said, and blah, blah, right? And one of the things that he said to me a few years ago is, I've been teaching law for all these years. I have never had a law student or another faculty member or something like that come to me and discuss something and I don't agree with them. And then they like say, well, this, that stunned me, because if this is what you're doing, if you're trying to produce academic people that are studying the finer points of theoretical law, surely these are the sorts of conversations that they'd want to have. But no, they're not doing that. And that's a problem, because you're not producing wise people who really know their thing. I would argue, maybe I'm arrogant about it, but I would argue that if you ask me questions about what I know, the derivatives and financial markets and stuff like that, I'm going to be able to give you a pretty good answer and a very holistic answer, and I can go into it in real depth because I know what I'm doing and I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, but
a lot of academics don't.
You're smarter than the average bear. You're smarter than the average bear. And you read a lot. Which is
hold on a second. Adam, just really quickly, I was going to teach you about something, because actually one of the reasons that one of the more successful law schools is actually in the HBCU here in Durham. Duke has a good law school, but Central has a good law school, and part of the reason that they're successful is because of what you just said. A lot of their law professors are actually practicing lawyers and everything.
Yeah, I know one of the faculty at NC's at North Carolina Central, and the reason they're successful is because they prepare their students with practical skills. But the vast majority of law students, you ask them when they graduate, write for me a motion for summary judgment. You ask them to write them a 12B6 motion to dismiss. You know what they're going to do? They're going to look at you, and they're not going to know what you're talking about. That is the problem with law schools. Now, academics are valuable, and they provide valuable services. But, I will say this about Dan, and I may be wrong, but Dan is precisely the type of dean that law schools need, not because of his political beliefs, but because of his real world experience and his common sense. But you will find the majority of deans have an ideological rather than a practical agenda. And the result is that it affects the kids that they are teaching, because they don't have good employment outcomes. They have a lot of debt. And ultimately, they admit students that shouldn't be admitted because the university is pressuring them for revenue.
I'm going to defer to you and you and everything.
Shaq wanted to talk about women voting for a second.
I was going to defer to that. I just had a quick answer for Adam. It's a very quick question for both Adam and Dan, and then I'm going to defer to you and Shaquille about the women's vote and everything. But are y'all fans? Because when I went to school, we had the track system. Literally, kids were tracked. They went to college. Like I was on the college track. There were other kids that were on the vocational track, and then there was a third track that I called, even though it was an official track, kind of the military real world track and everything. But it was a official track system in rural North Carolina. So I just wondering, are y'all fans of the track system?
Yeah, but it's expensive. It's expensive. When you strip schools down, that means you get rid of shop classes. You get rid of vocational classes.
Well, look what happened in World War II. They're able to compress high school and get those troops through high school and graduate in a short period of time, just by focusing on the material that was important to them. And that's because they needed people to go out and fight a war, but they wanted them to have the ability to think and reason and solve problems and make decisions. Our education system in the United States is broken. It's been broken for a long time. It's used as a method of socializing kids and brainwashing them and trying to create them into ideologues and that kind of thing in many, many states. That's exactly what happens. And we see that in California and places where they're pushing the trans ideology and everything else. That's not what they're supposed to be for. They're not supposed to be for that. They're supposed to be for providing the kids with the essential skills to succeed in society.
Let's talk about socializing, because there's philosophical socializing, but there's also socializing where you put a bunch of boys in with a bunch of girls and they learn how to deal with each other. And whatever education system you have, you got to get boys and girls and young men and young women in places where they're bouncing off of each other, where you have, because I mean, that's one of the reasons you want to go to college, to get a boyfriend or a girlfriend. I wanted to lose my virginity, and you need stuff like that, or else you have a population of incels who are happy, who don't make couples and don't make babies. So wherever,
but that's your generation's fault. Your generation gets out there, right? You smoke your
Wasn't mine.
your generation as well. You just may not have participated in it, right? You've got your Woodstock and your girls with their shirts off and your flower power and your combies and all your drugs and your quaaludes and your dope and all that sort of stuff. And then you tell the younger people, hey, be responsible. And now you've got a bunch of college kids that are going around, the best looking they're ever going to be, afraid that if they do anything, the boys are afraid that if they do anything or say anything or look the wrong way, they're going to be up on a sexual harassment charge. So that's why they're not doing anything. And you do see it because you've got these older people, the former hippies off the world saying, don't do drugs, kids. Don't drink too much. Don't have too much sex.
All those hippies ended up divorced and bitter. But anyway, so
yeah, okay, but you know what? I think I would rather, and I'm going on what you said because it's not my experience in life. But if they're only losing their virginity in college, I think I would rather be divorced and bitter than to be a virgin at 50.
All right, but let's talk about women voting while we're.
I've done
while we're talking about bouncing around. Okay, so I just wanted to bring this up, and it's really not relevant to this show, but I've been meaning to try and say it the last few times on World Edition when you brought it up. So you brought up in the polls that it appears that women are voting more than men by 10 or 11 points, right? It's a 55-45 sort of split. Mm-hmm. And I think you've essentially come to the conclusion that that's an indicator that Democrats may actually do a bit better than what the polls are showing. Look, that could be correct. There's every possibility that the polls are underestimating Democrat support, where in the past they've underestimated Republican and Trump support. Maybe they've done it the wrong way this time. Maybe they've overcorrected. Maybe they are just looking at the wrong data, and maybe that's happening. I don't think so, but we're all biased. So, but let's have a look at the women vote. Let's assume that you're correct. I've looked at a few polls in the last couple of weeks that have come up with a couple of very interesting things. One, Democrats, I believe, if I'm understanding things correctly, think that women are naturally going to vote more for Democrats for two reasons in this election. One is because they naturally do that, and two is because of abortion. But when you actually have a look at the poll samples, abortion is not the biggest issue for the majority of women. For the majority of women, it polls at about 13, 14, 15%. Secondly, for younger people, what we're seeing is that under 30s, the women under 30s had the abortion being their main issue at something like 48%. Back in the midterms, but now it's only rated at 38%. But that's only the women that are under 30. What we know about that demographic is they're not voting in particularly big numbers. And the older the women get, one, the more conservative they get, but two, the less an abortion's a problem for them or an issue for them.
Let me ask you a question.
So just quickly. So based on those numbers, I don't know whether necessarily an increase in the women's vote necessarily equates to an increase in Democratic support. And the big thing is enthusiasm. And what we've seen in some polls is that Republican women are more enthusiastic about voting than Democrat women in this election. So those polls could be wrong, but if they're not, that would actually indicate an even more horrendous result for the Democrats. Adam.
Well, yeah, what I would say is this very quickly. Why would women, number one, why would women who are past childbearing age put abortion at the top of their list? And number two, I assume women have an average to above average to genius IQ like men do, and they know abortion is a state issue. So why in God's name would women beyond child rearing age and those who know it's a state issue put abortion at the top of their list?
Well, exactly. But that's why I think you're going to get an oversampling in young women, because young women are only listening to the university professors and media. I think as women get a bit older, they're going to say much the same thing that I say. even if you really do think abortion should be absolutely a woman's choice and overturning Roe was a terrible thing, Dobbs' decision was bad, how does Kamala Harris fix that? She doesn't have the ability to the executive to fix it.
No, she doesn't.
Yeah, and I live in academia, and I can tell you, it really, really sucks. I hate it because although I'm one of the most popular professors, I'm one of the most despised colleagues simply because I have moderate to slightly conservative beliefs. And the discrimination among those who claim to be fans of inclusion makes it very uncomfortable. And that's very unfortunate because the ultimate people who suffer from that are the students because they don't get diverse perspectives and they don't learn how to do things that are going to benefit them in the real world.
True.
Well, listen, you can't work for me. Because if Trump can start his own university, I think we could have the University of Shaq, and you could be the dean of that uni.
Let me respond.
I'd work for you any day of the week.
Let Rick go, please, and I direct something at him.
All the points you made, they could very well be true, and we won't find it out for another 5 days.
Videos and everything in about a minute.
All right, so and Adam, I think the reason that
videos and everything, I don't see Kenny yet back. It's just you and
Mark, can you mute yourself, please? Because we can hear you.
So, and to Adam, I think the reason that women might be worked up about abortion on a national rather than a state level is because it was national politicians, well, Trump specifically, who made Roe go away by appointing conservative justices.
Well, hang on a minute, because a couple of interesting things about that is one that implies that conservative justices are going to think a certain way, rather than that they're just going to obey and interpret the Constitution. That's one thing. But yes, you're right. He has taken credit for it. He has done that. Well, sorry, if you want to say something, I'll come back to it.
No, I just want to. I could have been more specific and said he voted justices, or he appointed justices with the specific objective of them getting. Nobody's allowed to say what they're going to do about Roe, but they pretty much had a good idea.
Well, Rick, what else?
Have a look at this. Have a look at this thing with Roe, though. Abortion used to be something that Republicans supported. And you'll notice that many of the older Republicans and some of the more, traditional Republicans will actually say, I oppose abortion on moral grounds, but I believe it should be legal because the government shouldn't be able to say what happens with a woman's body. And prior to the evangelical vote switching to Republicans, this was a Republican position. Now, with Roe, Republicans were disappointed because they appointed some conservative justices, and the last one that they appointed voted for Roe. So the idea that Trump has appointed people because he thinks that they're going to vote a certain way on the issue, I think that undersells and undermines the justices. They are doing what they think the Constitution says.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I've been pleasantly surprised with some of the conservative justices. Usually not, but like Kavanaugh and Barrett sometimes surprise us by not being just knee-jerk everything the MAGAs want. They sometimes vote with the liberal bloc.
The majority of the time do. Everyone complains about 5-4 decisions. The majority of decisions that are handed down by the Supreme Court are 7-2, 8-1, 9-0. That's where the majority of decisions are.
Yeah, that's right. And Rick, one question I have for you before we stop, and I'll make it quick. You strike me as an incredibly intelligent person, and I also think you're a really cool dude. I like you. I think you're a good guy. I would like to know, and I mean this in a good faith way. I would like to know your reasons for voting for Kamala Harris.
Because I think Trump is chaotic and has zero experience in governing, and he's not great at studying stuff and doing, and like Trump wants to break stuff and he wants to drain the swamp. And all right, I kind of like the swamp. All right. So I like government the way it's been for the past 50 years, because I don't think government is the solution. I think technology and business are the solution. That's what's going to save America. That's what's going to save the world. And I think you need a sane, steady, it may be kind of shitty government in the background to let business be business, let tech be tech, and let tech and robots and the future frickin' save our asses. And that's why I dislike.
Wouldn't getting rid of
Thank you,
wouldn't
Rick. I
getting rid of government and making it smaller enable business and technology to thrive more with the absence of regulations?
Okay,
Is that not?
I mean, somebody I'm sure has written a book, and it should be written, about why regulations fail. Regulations fail because they miss the mark, or they have unintended consequences that fuck things up worse.
Yep.
So yeah, regulations should be scrutinized, and crappy ones should be gotten rid of. I don't trust Trump, or I guess I trust Musk a little more, but I don't trust either of them to get it right about which regulations they get rid of.
I trust them a lot more than Harris.
I like that. Sorry, Dan.
I trust them a lot more than Harris, though, Rick. I mean, you say Trump doesn't have experience. He does. He had 4 years of experience leading the country, and he has had better policies than Kamala Harris has ever proposed. Kamala has just been she'll be a stamp type of president for anything that the left wants to put in front of her, just like her boss was.
Yeah, okay, maybe, but neither president's going to stamp much of anything, because we're going to be paralyzed again by a closely divided House and Senate.
Let's hope so.
You got to end this conversation. We'll have a conversation later. We'll actually try to do another show, so definitely time to end.
Hang around, Rick. We'll be backstage for a bit, so hang around if you want to join us.
Okay.